Capricornus, the dark battle with the mysterious entity. I grew up on a small farm in the middle of nowhere, raised by Christian parents in the middle of the Bible Belt. Needless to say, my upbringing was strict. Every Sunday we would be the first people at the church. My father was a layperson and my mother worked with the youth and nursery groups. I was even involved for some time with the music program. We prayed before every meal, were baptized as a family, and attended every Wednesday service we could. The only time we ever really skipped was when my mother would fall ill. For a while, this routine felt safe and correct. This is because it got me out of the house and away from my mother, whose demeanor would change when we were out of the public eye, or when my father would leave the country for work. To the outsider looking in, we were a happy family with strong bonds, but on the inside, it was a different story. You see, I believe that every family has a dark secret to hide. Murders, crimes, betrayals. Ours was our mother. She was an aggressive woman with violent tendencies. I remember a bad grade used to get me a few whacks to the side of the head, an F, and it was game over. She was a perfectionist with a God complex and expected absolute perfection from everyone around her, especially me. For a while, I tried to reach her unobtainable standards, but after failing every time, I threw my life to the wind and started gambling with the stakes. It started off small, a C in English, a few missed dishes, forgetting to make my bed. It went on for a while like this, with her anger and frustration growing by the day. Eventually, I got up the nerve to take my experiment to the public. I wanted to see how long she could contain herself. I would mess up on speeches, sing too quietly at church, or wear too much black in front of the church crowd. All of these were tipping points at the end of the day, though none compared to that night. To preface this, let me start by saying my family did not have just one dirty little secret. They had two, and I was the other. You see, I have a history of violence towards myself. Cutting, pills, and even a few suicide attempts. Many that should have worked. When I couldn't take much more, I started looking for alternatives, and boy did I find one. Witchcraft. I know how it sounds, but when you are put in a dangerous situation that nobody will help you out of, you end up finding the strangest of solutions. But what about my religion, you may ask? Well, I had given up faith a while ago. Surely any God who allows their children to be treated like this is not one worth following, especially when they claim to be all-loving. So I turned to more drastic measures. It started small, with a few protection spells here and there to keep her out of my room at night, a charm to slip in and out of rooms unnoticed, and a curse that I was keeping in my back pocket. I did not know how well I could trust these things, as I had gotten them all from claimed witches on the internet. But so far, the spells and the charm seemed to be working, and my life quieted down just a bit. It was not anything crazy, but it was enough to let me breathe a little easier. Unfortunately, my peace was short-lived when somebody told my mother they suspected me of harming myself. It started like any other fight regarding my mental health. My problems were not real. I only wanted attention. An endless stream of accusations flowed from her as she slowly walked towards me. Rage flashed behind her eyes, going on about how I was an embarrassment to the family and how I did not deserve to be a part of it. That's when she took her first swing. At the same moment, something in my gut told me to duck. She missed my face by inches. Of course, not landing her punch only infuriated her more, and she rushed me, grabbing me by my neck and slamming me into the wall, cutting off my air supply. I grabbed onto her arm and kicked at her with everything I had, landing a solid blow to her knee. She yanked me from the wall and slammed her fist into the center of my back, sending me gasping to the floor. I lay there for a moment, My vision is fuzzy. I could hear my mother screaming at me to get up. After what felt like hours, I was finally able to stand up. As I did, I made eye contact with the woman standing in front of me. She shouted at me, saying if I ever embarrassed her like that again, she would kill me. I could feel the heat of my anger and hatred start to rise as I stepped forward to fight back. When I did, she threw a bowl at my face, laughing like a maniac. My heartbeat was so rapid I could feel it in my fingertips. Before I knew what was happening, I was making a mad dash to the back door and out into the darkness. Outside, a storm was brewing, the thunder crashing overhead as I sprinted into the field behind my house. The wind whipped at my face and the rain pelted my back, but I did not care. By now, the rage inside of me was boiling over, and I could feel it taking over. My pulsing fingertips began to grow hot as I remembered the curse. It was a simple one made to avenge any wrongdoings done to the caster. It just so happened. I had many. I racked my brain for the words. In tenebris dormit, nigrior aduc, non patitur lumen ad voluntatem meam, expergiscimini ex altissimo somno tuo, expergiscimini et vindicate me. The words raced through my mind and poured out of my mouth before I even knew what was happening. I shouted them into the wind, over and over as if I were beating it into her physical body, putting more rage, more hatred behind each line until the words were unintelligible. After one last round of shouting into the thunder and darkness, I let out a terrifying scream, loud and shrill and filled with malice. This was my revenge. The air around me grew cold, and the storm raged with such ferocity that the trees bowed to the wind. The warm, pulsating feeling in my fingers grew stone cold and spread across my body. My chest tightened and my mouth twisted into a gruesome smile. It felt as if something dark was taking over, and I did not want to stop it. I opened my heart to the darkness and welcomed the sleeping beast in, willing it to awaken. I wanted justice. I wanted revenge. I wanted death. For either her or I, it did not matter. I demanded vengeance. After a few minutes, the world grew eerily quiet, and my body temperature returned to normal. My knees began to shake, and my eyes grew heavy. I felt the world spin as I blacked out. When I came to, all the lights in the house were off. Nobody waited up. And why should they? I'm not one of them anyway. I was an abomination to human nature to them now. No longer part of the sweet Christian family that was all too good at acting. I made my way back to the house and to my room, falling into bed and quickly finding sleep. In my dream, I was back in the field looking up at the cloud-covered sky. Only this time it was looking back at me with two fierce golden eyes. It bellowed out in a voice like thunder, asking what I wished for. For me, there were two very simple things that I wanted: justice and protection. The clouds began to swirl into a funnel, creating a spindly, slow-moving tornado. It slowly made its way to the ground, and a creature made of mist stepped out. It slowly began to take the form of a tall person. I managed to get a glimpse of red before I was jolted awake. I could hear my sister crying in the kitchen. The house felt heavier than usual this morning. I stepped out of my room and into the hallway, making my way to the kitchen. My sister sat at the table, hands shaking. My mother stood quietly in the corner. In the night, somebody had crept into our barn and slaughtered my sister's goat. They had slit its throat and belly, piling its guts on top of it. A sinister feeling crept into my chest as I remembered hearing about a nearby, small-time cult. It was suggested that they were behind it. To make matters worse, its severed ear was left at our back doorstep, like some form of warning. This rocked the whole neighborhood, what few we had anyway. The death of a goat in such a manner in a place like this was seen as a bad omen, the devil's work. We did not have gangs or unruly rebels in the area, and my sister did not have it in her to do something so gruesome. A dark cloud had settled over the household, heavier than ever. Something was happening. Something that was now out of my control. Was this a result of my curse? Or was it a cult? If it was, why us? It's not like we were the only farm with goats. What were we the target of? The rest of the week went by without incident. Things were unsettlingly quiet around the house. My sister was looking for a new goat, my father was away, and my mother spent most of her time sleeping, her illness worsening in no time. I still crept quietly around, completely unnoticed, just in case she got a burst of energy. The only difference was my mother complaining about the darkness in the house that came and went with me. This is not the first time she said something like that, but she had never worded it like that before. Now that it has been said aloud, I have noticed a strange new presence that I can never seem to shake. Almost like a heavy blanket had been placed on my shoulders. One night I was lying in bed, my dog resting peacefully in the corner. I closed my eyes for a moment and felt the world immediately fall away as the air grew cold around me. I turned to look in the direction that would have been where my door was and saw a tall, pale figure with empty eyes and 4 sharp horns staring directly at me. A crooked grin spread across its face. It shuffled in place for a moment before making a mad launch toward me. I fell backward and tried to let out a scream, but the air felt so thick in my lungs nothing came out. The figure was about to jump on me when I was finally able to let out a scream. The next thing I knew, I was jumping out of bed and running towards the light switch. My dog was standing in the corner with his back arched slightly and all his hair was sticking up on his neck. I could see the light in the hallway turn on just before my door swung open. It was my mother. Her frame blocked the entire doorway. She demanded to know what all the noise was about. I desperately tried to play it off as a bad dream. Thankfully, she bought it this time. As she exited my room, I could feel my heart begin to pound. It was as if it had been standing still that entire time. The next day, I decided to ward my room using salt and oils that I stole from the kitchen. I made a solid line of salt on the inside of my door so it could not be seen, and I put one on my windowsill, spreading the oil along the frame. When I was sure it was safe, I left the house for the day. Throughout the day, I was finding it harder and harder to focus. My mind wandered back to the thing in my room, its empty eyes boring into mine. My hands never stopped trembling, but oddly enough, not from fear, but anticipation. Like something big was going to happen, something big and terrible. When I finally made it home, I went straight to my room and locked myself in. My mother wasn't due home until later in the night, so I knew it would be fine, at least for a little while. I could hear my sister watching television in the living room, laughing at some show she recently got into. I tried to stay calm as I thought about the weekend ahead. My sister would be out of town, leaving me alone with my mother. It's nothing I couldn't handle, but it was still a less than appealing situation. My thoughts continued uninterrupted for a while until I started to hear footsteps coming down the hall. I focused my attention on the sound and realized I no longer heard the television. Just this strange, uneven footstep. This couldn't possibly be my sister, was it? The footsteps continued to thump down the hall until they came to an abrupt stop, right at my bedroom door. I called my sister but received no answer. I called my mother and the results were the same. I felt a chill go down my spine as I looked between my door and the floor. To my shock and horror, I saw not my sister's feet, not my mother's, but a pair of black fur-covered hooves. They paced back and forth in front of my door for what seemed like an eternity, but all I could do was sit, frozen in shock or fear. I couldn't really tell you. Then, mid-step, the hooves vanished, and an uneasiness washed over me. I got up and walked to my door, reaching for the handle. But something deep in me made me stop short. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, my breath catching on every other inhale. Everything in me was telling me not to open that door. That's when I heard it. My sister let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the house. She threw open her bedroom door, causing it to slam against the wall. She crossed the hall to my door and began pounding frantically on it. When I heard her voice coming from the other side, I felt every muscle in my body relax. When I finally opened the door for her, she rushed in and immediately began telling me about the shadow outside of her bedroom window. It stood about 7 feet tall and was completely black. But what she said next is what sent my mind spinning. She told me that the shadow looked like a man with a goat's head, and from its head grew 4 sharp-looking horns. It was only slightly different from the man I saw in my room, the one with the empty eyes. Had it changed its form to scare my sister, or had it appeared more human to make me feel less afraid of it? We heard a loud slam coming from the living room. My mother was home. She stormed down the hall and immediately began screaming about embarrassing her yet again. She pushed me to the ground and grabbed me by my hair. Yanking me to my knees, she warned that if I ever embarrassed her in a public setting again, it would be the last thing I ever did. I couldn't tell you what I did this time. I've been so out of it these last few days, I probably couldn't even tell you where I was. Hot tears streamed down my face, and I felt my blood start to boil. I pleaded at that moment for my torture to finally be over. All of the pressure, the physical abuse, the inappropriate comments and behavior, everything. Either I die or she does. She released the wad of my hair she held and shoved me back down. I stood up in front of her, trying my best to seem unafraid. The air around me took on a now familiar chill, and my eyes locked onto hers. We stayed, stuck in a staring contest for what seemed like hours. After what was probably only a couple of minutes, I saw her eyes start to roll back into her head as she lost steady footing for a moment. I took the opportunity to suggest she go lie down. It was late after all. Without a word, my mother turned and left the room, shutting herself into her own. My sister turned to look at me in disbelief before leaving herself. The chill in my room remained. That's when I realized the salt line had been broken. I stayed up that night, watching the door. Once again the hooves came back, but rather than pacing, they stood still outside of my door, facing the hallway, almost as if it was standing guard. What was I going to do about this weekend? Was there even anything I could do? And what about this thing waiting outside my door? The award was no longer up, so why was it just standing there? These thoughts raced through my mind at breakneck speeds. The thoughts were moving so quickly, around and around in an endless loop. I thought I might get sick. I felt my heart rate spike as a wave of panic took over. Once again, I felt tears stream down my face as voices screamed in my head, telling me I would never make it out of there with my life. I felt myself start to hyperventilate as the panic increased. Just as it peaked and I fell into a fit of uncontrollable shaking, I felt my eyes get heavy and the corners of my vision started to blur. I was blacking out. It was still dark when I came to. I could hear my sister moving about the house, getting ready to leave for her weekend trip to San Antonio. That means it was somewhere between 4 and 5 in the morning. To confirm my suspicions, a bright set of headlights turned into our driveway, casting shadows into my room. The long, spindly arms of the tree in front of my house stretched across my wall, twisting eerily in silence. I heard the front door open and close twice, once for my mother and again for my sister. That's when the sound of uneven footsteps came down the hall once more. Only this time my door crept open, revealing the same goat man my sister had seen at her window. His head was covered in black fur and nearly reflected the light coming in from outside. It would swap back and forth between the goat head and the human one, always keeping its horns. His eyes, however, remained as empty as ever. I saw him raise a single hoof, which was the same color as his head, a strange, reflective black, and slam it onto the floor. As soon as it made contact, the branches on my wall shot out and grabbed me, twisting tightly around me. My body struggled against the pressure, but they only squeezed tighter. He raised his foot to stomp again, and this time when his hoof hit the hardwood, I fell unconscious. I woke up in a cold sweat the next morning, surrounded by sunlight. The birds outside sang their usual song. Only today things seemed almost brighter. My mother was going to be home with me all day today, but truthfully, I was hardly worried. I pulled myself out of bed and quietly crept to the kitchen for some water. My mother was already waiting for me. She had made breakfast, pancakes. I sat down at the table, never taking my eyes off her. I sat with my back straight, and my feet were pointed up onto my toes, ready to run at any moment. She slowly walked up to me, pulling out the chair next to me. She lowered herself slowly into her chair and looked into my eyes, sizing me up. Her eyes were sunken in and bloodshot, as if she hadn't slept for days. She took a deep breath and began talking about last night and how she stepped in something funny coming through my doorway. She quickly stretched her hand across the table, causing me to flinch and grab the salt. She shook some into her hand and slowly poured it onto the table in front of me. Before I knew what I was doing, I slid back in my chair and moved to stand up, but she was too quick. She grabbed hold of my wrist and pulled me back down into my chair. She began to explain how she received regular online history reports from my personal devices. She had seen all of my research on protection spells. Her talking quickly turned to yelling as she went on about how disgraceful I was, lost from God. When I gave no reaction to her saying that, she flew into a rage. Throwing her chair back, she grabbed the salt shaker and hit me over the head, over and over as many times as she could before I was able to push her away. As I scurried away from her, she began speaking again. She had read the dark things I had written in my journal. She reached down and grabbed my ankle, pulling me back. My mind was going, I was possessed by a demon, or was in fact a demon that needed cleansing. As she said this, she pressed her foot into my back, putting all of her body weight into it until my spine cracked. This time I couldn't help but let out a scream. This only excited her more. Reaching down, she grabbed my shoulder and flipped me around, sitting down across my waist. I brought my hands up to cover my face, but she grabbed them again, twisting them out of the way, causing tears to form in my eyes. I couldn't let her see me cry. She bent down and sunk her teeth into my eyebrow. I could feel a small trickle of blood drip down as she pressed even harder, laughing as I squirmed under her. I cried out in pain, knowing nobody could hear me, or even cared for that matter. She slammed my wrists into the floor above my head. Shifting her weight to one side, she dug her knee into my stomach, causing me to cough. She called me a disgusting disease and spit in my face, telling me I deserved to be put down like the animal I was. She pressed harder into my stomach, restricting my breathing to a large degree. I struggled underneath her, desperate to free myself. I looked to the side of me, desperate for anything that may save me. There was nothing. As my vision started to blur, I couldn't help but think that this was where my life was going to end, on my living room floor. Who really knows how she would do it? I just hoped it would be fast. I could feel myself getting lightheaded as she let go of one wrist to grab my throat. Strangulation. She explained that I was such a high suicide risk, nobody would have trouble believing I had taken my own life. Thankfully, she was so distracted by my throat she forgot about my free hand. With every ounce of strength left in me, I reached up and grabbed a fistful of her hair and yanked it above my head as far as I could reach. This caused her knee to ease up just enough for me to wiggle free. She screamed in pain and anger, not used to having somebody fight back. I pulled her head closer to me and smashed mine into hers with everything I had. Her eyes rolled and she loosened her grip around my neck for just a moment. but it was long enough for me to break free. I wiped the blood from my eyelid and stood up as much as I possibly could, gasping for air as I did. Before I could make it out of the house, she was standing up again, her head tilted back, looking blankly at the ceiling. I took a few steps back as she picked up a belt she had stored away and slowly walked towards me, her breathing heavy and uneven. She took a couple more paces and lunged, swinging the belt like a madman, striking me across the chest and face. I reached behind me but found only pancakes on paper plates. She was prepared from the moment I woke up. She was waiting until my sister was out of the house. No witnesses, no crime, just a grieving mother and a broken family. A perfect sob story. It was supposed to be a clean job, but once again I've made a mess of things. Now she would have to find a high cliff to explain the cuts and bruises. I swung my arms wildly as she came at me with another attack, managing to munch her once in the temple and again in the jaw. The shock of this sent her stumbling back, and without thinking, I made a mad dash to my room. Why? Because something deep in my gut was screaming for me to get there as soon as I could. I slammed the door behind me and locked it. I ran to the window and slid it open. I was working on the screws in the screen when I heard a banging on my door. Again, I had the feeling that I should stay far away from my door. That's when I heard it. A single loud thud followed by a shrill scream that must have come from my mother. Then everything was quiet. Ever so slowly, my door unlocked and opened with a moan. The sight that awaited me was horrific. My mother was there, hardly standing on her own, with a gaping hole in her stomach. And there, holding her up by the roots of her hair, blood dripping off one of its gruesome horns and down its too tall body, the goat man from my sister's window, the one from my hallucination. It stamped its hoof at me, staring me down. It was as if it was waiting for something. I let out a small cry, mostly in disbelief rather than fear. It stomped again, growing impatient. My mother sat there limply, whimpering and begging for mercy. I mustered every bit of courage I had and stepped forward toward her. How could she possibly speak of mercy after trying to kill me? I stood at the center of my room, not daring to get any closer. This thing, it was real, actually real, standing in my doorway, holding my mother up. It watched me closely, turning its head slightly to look me in the eyes. It felt as though this thing was reading my inner thoughts, reaching places in my subconscious I wasn't even aware of. Then its head morphed, and it appeared more human. It gave me that same crooked grin as last time, only now there was a more sinister meaning behind it. I felt my stomach sink as it raised its free hand and placed it on her shoulder. She let out a frightened whimper once more, and again pleaded for her life. What was happening? It seemed to stabilize her body on the ground before pulling up with what looked like no force at all. There was a horrifying ripping noise, followed by a loud pop. Blood splattered along my bedroom walls as this creature swiftly decapitated my mother and dropped her lifeless body on the ground. The moment her corpse touched the ground, it burst into flames. Was this really justice? I sat in horror, my knees buckling underneath me as I watched her body char. The fire started to spread down the hall and up my bedroom walls. The creature still stood there, engulfed in the flames, its head once again that of a goat. Smoke filled the room, causing my eyes to sting and my vision get all blurry. I had to get out. The fire roared toward the ceiling, and I knew it would come down at any moment. Smoke started to fill my lungs as it all tried to escape from the window. I followed the smoke and felt around the wall until I found the window screen. My body must have entered fight or flight mode because I was able to kick the screen out after 3 tries. I fell through the window and looked back, seeing the creature still standing there over my dead mother. and I watched as it dematerialized right in front of me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't actually gone. I stood up and ran to take cover in the woods. It wouldn't be long before fire rescue showed up, and when they find my mother's body, the authorities. I took cover in the woods. Having grown up in them, I took comfort in my knowledge of traversing this particular area. I could hear the sounds of sirens in the distance as I made my way down the near-invisible game trail, knowing it would lead me to water and then possibly a road somewhere if I followed it deep enough. But this was one trip I was willing to take. I needed to disappear. Maybe hitchhike to someplace in the north. Anywhere but here. Years later, the papers would go on to call it the tragedy that rocked that entire town to its core. A mother decapitated and burnt to nearly nothing in her own home, and a daughter gone missing. Nobody would ever discover where she went. Some say she died of starvation. Others believe she is still alive, somewhere being held as a slave, the victim of a kidnapping gone wrong. But the truth is, I've never been freer in my life. Though every now and again, out of the corner of my eyes, I see it waiting for next time, and a chill will cut through the air, causing me to shiver. The Shambler in the Attic. Must you have battle in your heart forever, the bloody toil of combat? Old contender, will you not yield to the immortal gods? This nightmare cannot die, being eternal evil itself. The horror, pain, and chaos. There is no fighting it. No power can fight it. All that avails is flight. The Odyssey. Dear James, I write to inform you that your persistent inquiries into the Byron House incident have finally worn away the last threads of reticence I may have developed regarding its open discussion. I have warned you more than enough in my various replies over the past few years. But if you still desire to know the truth of what happened at that accursed house, on that accursed night, read on. I urge you not to do so, however. Some things are best left buried in the past, or in this case, buried beneath the charred rubble and crumbled stone of that hideous edifice. I do not write this letter easily. Even now, the events surrounding that night create a panic that causes a cold dread to creep across my skin. To even briefly recall what I saw on that night, and of the measures I took to end it, causes my mind to unravel in terror at what vague horrors may still lurk beneath the bricks and mortar of that terrible place. Although my account is undoubtedly localized in its scope, it hints at a much larger gathering of nightmarish forces at work in the hidden, shadowed corners of the earth and beyond. The lurking unknown that lairs in the twisting vistas of the deepest cosmic spheres and the lightless chasms of the unnamable blackness of the outside. I have long since burned all my diary entries detailing Byron House and my subsequent correspondences with occultists, pseudoscientists, and fringe scholars from across the globe. All that remains is the very letter you now hold in your hands. Because I have destroyed all written record of what happened at the house, I am relying purely upon my memory to recount the shadowed details. The horrid truth is that I have forgotten much of it, and what remains feels like little more than the fevered hallucinations of an oversensitive and morbid imagination. It may be for the best that I struggle to remember the exact facts of the matter, a blessing for the both of us, in fact. I will now detail for you that terrible chain of events that led me to soak the attic room of Byron House in gasoline and burn the building down to cinders, free of all its occupants, save one. You may recall that I have always held an interest in the afflictions of the mind and a morbid fascination with those poor souls with which such illnesses hold enthralled. Well, in my younger years, before I became a doctor, and was still very much under the subjugation of academic studies, I took on the role of an orderly at Byron House. For me, then, the job was more than a way to pay my university fees, but a way for me to get close to that unseen world of lunacy and madness. Byron House had once been a home for the elderly, but was closed for unknown circumstance, only to be bought and reopened privately by one Dr. Samuel Monroe as a home for the mentally ill. I knew of the house long before I ever worked there. Everyone in Barton did, I think. In my childhood, it served perfectly as the quintessential haunted house for me and my small coterie of friends. Whereas they looked upon the building as a means of acquiring a cheap thrill, calling the staff and residents names before running away, I looked upon it with a chilling but irresistible dread. Even then, the macabre held me in its grip of fascination. It wasn't wraiths bound in chains or moaning specters that captivated my imagination. No, Byron's phantoms were bound in the crippled gray flesh of those elderly inhabitants. I would watch them, shambling around its gardens, waiting, perhaps even hoping, for death to swoop down and take them. I sat for hours, motionless behind a hedge, and watched their frail, brittle bodies wander around the wide lawns, seemingly unaware of the moribundity of their surroundings. I made a vow to myself one day that I would never allow old age to take me. I was determined that I would die relatively young and energetic. Better to go suddenly in the throes of youth than slowly rot away within the walls of a tomb like Byron House. Time has passed, however, and I have failed to keep my vow. Many times I have considered taking my own life, but something has always pulled me back from the precipice of saturnine thoughts. I started my job as a fresh-faced, naive youth, eager to learn all I could from some honest hands-on experience. There were 12 inmates at the house, each laboring under a complex cocktail of mental disturbances and psychoses. The inmates were overseen and cared for by 8 staff members of various rank. At the very top there was Dr. Monroe, while at the bottom there were the orderlies like me. The conditions of the inmates ranged drastically, from hysteria, monomania, and psychopathy to feeble-mindedness and retardation. My fellow workers were likewise a mixed bag. One that really stood out was Williams, an ape of a man whose large frame was well suited to restraining rampaging inmates, as well as beating them on occasion, if the rumors about him were true. Another standout was Jane, a well-mannered but somewhat jaded divorcee approaching 50. Jane was part of the government's new nurse training program, and she was always on hand to offer advice regarding administering medication, but there was no warmth in her towards the inmates, and I often wondered why she chose this kind of career for herself. Then there was Dr. Monroe, a distant and stern figure. I got the impression that he in some way resented his position at the house, and he was rarely seen outside of his office. In addition to those 3, there were several new starters, some students like me, and some more local strong-arms who were only good for lifting and carrying uncooperative inmates. I regret that I cannot remember any more names or faces, despite the impact it has had upon my life. My time at Byron House was mercifully brief. Now I said there were 12 inmates, and at first that is what I thought when I started my job. I quickly learned through staff gossip and whispered hearsay, however, that a 13th inmate was being treated at the house. A rare and special inmate, whose condition was so extreme that it demanded constant specialized care from Dr. Monroe personally. I eventually learned that this inmate's name was Jonathan Spencer. He was ominously nicknamed 13 by the staff, and he resided at the very top of the house in the attic space, which had been specially renovated to accommodate him. Unlike the other inmates who were permitted to occasionally visit their families, 13 never left the house. He never even left his attic room, and all the staff except for Dr. Monroe were forbidden from going to the top floor of the house. Jane once told me a story about a young girl who had come to work at the house several years ago as a porter. She had been working the graveyard shift, and Monroe was away on a rare occasion hosting a lecture at Manchester University, leaving her on her own. She had heard 13 banging around upstairs, and despite being told to never visit the top floor, she decided to go up to the attic to make sure everything was okay. Upon investigating, she had run screaming from the house into the night, never to return. After that time, Monroe became even more paranoid about exposing Spencer to the rest of the staff, and would often sleep over at the house in his office to ensure that a similar incident did not occur. Although she didn't like Monroe, Jane was happy that the grim man spent most of his time at the house. It meant that she didn't have to deal with 13 in any way. As far as she knew, Spencer had always lived in the attic, even before she came to work there, which had been a great deal longer than she cared to admit. Williams didn't have much to say on the matter. He seemed to think that 13's condition was more physical than mental, that it was his body that was deformed rather than his mind. Even though the man was large and not afraid of any of the other inmates, he would grow nervous when working the top floors of the house. Monroe was quick to inflict Williams upon unruly inmates, but as much of a lackey that he was, even he was not permitted near the attic. Between myself and the other orderlies, 13 was a source of constant gossip. None of us had ever seen or even heard him, and apart from that one singular horrifying moment in time that I endured, none of us would ever see him either. My own curiosity regarding the attic and its occupant grew by the day, but Monroe was protective, fanatically so, when it came to Spencer's care. Despite volunteering to help, the doctor would just brush aside my inquisitiveness with an annoyed wave of his hand. As fate would have it, I was permitted an entrance into that insane dark world where few among mankind have tread, and it happened sooner than I thought it would. It was December, and I had been working at the home for a little under 2 months when Jane came into the staff room one morning with a cup of coffee, a pack of cigarettes, and a look of pure vexation on her ashen face. I had never noticed that she smoked before that day, but she had been in the room no longer than a few seconds before she had lit up a slender white stick and slumped down in the chair opposite me. She didn't talk to me straight away, or even look at me. She just sat down, almost as if in shock, and drank from her coffee cup and took the occasional long, languid pull from her cigarette. I tried several times to ignore her and go back to reading an article that had caught my interest, but my gaze was always drawn back to her wide, unblinking eyes. "Okay," I said, folding the paper and slapping it down on the chair next to me. "What is it? What's wrong?" I had developed a casual friendship with Jane, despite her being my senior, and we often talked in a direct, no-nonsense manner. She finished her cigarette and immediately lit another before answering my questions. "I was on shift last night," she said quietly. "I was working the graveyard. I'm having to cover for a staff absence." "Oh, whose?" I sat up interested. "Monroe. He's got a virus and can't risk passing it on to any of the inmates, especially." She paused for a few seconds. 13? I prodded. She didn't say anything. She just nodded slowly. I didn't question anymore, as I could tell that whatever ordeal she had gone through the previous night, she wasn't keen on elaborating further. I sat for a few minutes and pondered. This was my chance, I thought. I had been curious about 13 for a while, and I had hoped to get involved in his care. With Monroe away and off sick, a window of opportunity had opened up before me. "So," I said, startling Jane out of her thoughts, "I take it you're having to work tonight too?" She grimly nodded with a sense of total defeat. "Well, I could always work instead. I don't mind. I've even asked Monroe a couple of times if I could assist with 13. You see, I'm writing a paper for college at the moment, and..." She cut me off and stood up out of her chair. "Really? You wouldn't mind? Are you sure?" "Of course," I replied. "Although Monroe has probably asked you to cover as you're the most senior member of staff. I'm not sure he would be pleased if he found out we had swapped shifts." She thought for a moment before replying, "Well, I won't tell him if you don't. I can pay you directly from my pay packet. No need to change the rota." I nodded in agreement. "It's settled then. You finish here early and I'll stay on to work the night shift. I may need to quickly go home and grab some things, but it won't take long. I live quite close." The relief that washed across her face was at once pleasant to see, yet also concerning, for I knew that, should I go through with my offer, a good night's sleep would not be on the cards. She perked up considerably and continued to work for the rest of the day, planning to leave a little before 7 p.m. She was good enough to provide me with a list of chores I would need for the night shift, and I spent the rest of the day working my usual rounds. I don't think the impact of what I had offered to do had truly sunk in, and I remember feeling more excited than anything else. As the daylight hours gave way to the dark of the December evening, the rest of the staff left one by one, not too long after Jane had departed, and it was only then that the situation dawned on me. Williams shot me a cruel look on his way out that made me uneasy and left me to ponder if he knew more about what was in store for me than he had let on during his various digs and jibes made at me during the day shift. I had never worked the graveyard shift before. Others had, of course, and they had said that despite his unsociable nature, the presence of Dr. Monroe was always a reassuring one. At least having a normal person in the house with you was comforting, with the added bonus that, as a trained doctor, he could handle any situation that might arise from the myriad possibilities available. But as night crept on, and the inmates were safely restrained in their rooms, I began to feel an oppressive cloak of loneliness wrap heavily around my shoulders. At 9 o'clock, I prepared medication and a light supper for Spencer, the details of which Jane had written down for me, along with instructions on how to offer them to him. The meal consisted of nothing more than a plate of scrambled eggs and some fresh orange juice with a straw. The medication, too, was simple: some pain relief, nutritional supplements, and allergy treatments. There was nothing in the medication that would suggest a psychosis or mood-stabilizing treatment was required for him. Whatever 13's disorder was, I thought, it was clear that it wasn't a mental ailment, but something physical that could not be cured, only treated. I wondered how much time the unlucky resident must have left, if indeed he was suffering from a physical disease, as I ascended the stairs with my tray in hand. I paused momentarily at the landing on the 3rd floor and listened for any sound coming from the other inmates. After a few seconds, satisfied that there was no disturbance, I continued. This was the closest I had been to the attic since I started my job, and the thought of venturing upwards filled me with dread. I cleared my mind, however, and shook off my doubts away as I headed for the final set of steps that would bring me to the lonesome attic room. The stairs from the 3rd floor led straight up and then curved slightly as they ascended upward and to the left. They grew narrower the higher I climbed, but the ceiling appeared to lower and grow cramped, giving me a distinct feeling of being boxed in. I stopped as the bend curved around more tightly and finally revealed the entrance to 13's room. I was maybe 10 steps away from the looming wooden door. It had been painted white some time ago, but large chalky flakes had fallen away, revealing the original oaken surface beneath. Just as Jane had described, a small flap had been crudely cut out of the bottom and nailed back on, and it was just wide enough to slide the tray under. The door seemed almost ethereal, as it stood alone and silent at the top of the staircase. It was something that I had only heard of in hushed whispers, but it now stood before me in all its horrid reality. I had moved no more than a single step towards the door, when I heard an excited movement coming from the other side. I say movement, but to be precise, the exact sequence of noises that followed gave the impression of awful, liquescent gesticulations. First, there came a soft thud, as if something had dropped from a small height. The noise was softly muted, as if whatever had landed had been cushioned by thick folds. I thought at the time that this was probably attributed to something like Spencer rolling out of his bed whilst wrapped in thick blankets. But there was a certain hinted wetness about the sound that baffled me. Secondly, and more repulsively, a low dragging sound followed by a labored breathing could be heard. It grew louder the longer I stood, but appeared to take a long time to get to the door. It was as if whatever mass inhabiting the room was closing in on my location with a deliberate, ghoulish lethargy. Horror took hold of my heart, but the rational in me demanded I maintain clear thinking. In a burst of what I can only describe as mad curiosity, I ascended the stairs and set down the tray at the bottom of the door. Then I pushed my body down flat against the stairs so that my head was level with the half-inch gap between the floor and the bottom of the door. What greeted me on the other side will haunt me until the end of my days, for looking back at me was a set of bulbous, bloodshot eyes. I don't remember running down the stairs, but I do remember going into the ground floor bathroom and vomiting. A silly reaction, you might think, but there was something about those eyes that disturbed me to my very core. It may have been the odd spacing between them, or the way they had seemed to roll around sluggishly and loose in their sockets. For some reason, I couldn't banish the thought of a toad or frog from my mind, as if my brain was struggling to conjure up the most obvious terrestrial comparison to the alien eyes that had glared back at me. I spent the rest of my shift in the staff room drinking coffee and waiting for the December sun to rise. When it finally did so, I packed up my things and waited for Jane and the other morning staff to relieve me of my duty. I said nothing to Jane as she approached me and asked how the night had gone. I think I managed a weak smile and a dismissive, "It was fine," before hurriedly leaving the premises and making my way home. As fortune would have it, my week on shift came to an end the very next day, and I spent some free time in total seclusion at my flat. I slept a lot but did not feel refreshed. I could not get those eyes out of my mind, and they continued to haunt me for days afterwards with restless, vivid dreams. When I did return to work a few days later, I confined myself to studying my coursework in the staff room as much as I could. No one bothered me, as I sat in deep concentration over various books and papers. Despite the distraction, I could not banish that awful night from my mind. Dr. Monroe was still off with a virus, so I assumed that the other staff had covered the night shifts during my week of respite. Nobody spoke of or reported any strange happenings or eventful encounters, however. Despite my shock, a morbid fascination was creeping over me. I felt I had seen something not only horrifying, but also enlightening, and my mind burned with the duality of horror and curiosity. My thoughts kept snapping back to those eyes. What terrible affliction could have caused such physical madness of form? If I could perhaps speak with Spencer, especially with Dr. Monroe, currently out of the picture, maybe I could make the unfortunate patient the focus of my academic work. At the very least, I could find some rational and mundane reason that would explain what I had seen that night. A few more days working my ordinary rounds, and my mind was made up. I approached Jane and stated clearly that whilst Monroe was off ill, I would like to personally take over her night shifts in the house, the same deal as before. Unsurprisingly, she was eager to facilitate my request without protest. My next shift began that very night, and I pondered my renewed focus as I prepared the medication and evening meal to take up to the attic. Again, it was a simple setup, some mashed potato and a milky cup of tea with straw. I looked distastefully at the pan of steaming mash and wondered if 13 ever grew tired of the sloppy menu Dr. Monroe had set down for him. All the meals were clearly designed for someone with only the most rudimentary of eating ability. It was more like the kind of food you would feed to a baby than a man. It was all soft puddings, mashed vegetables, and liquid nourishment. With a newly fortified resolve, I made my way back to the attic with my tray, this time without pausing. As I ascended that last set of stairs, something did indeed greet me at the door. It was not an object of terror or disgust, but rather an item that made me immediately question its validity as something that belonged to this exact time and place. It was a small piece of plain paper, a little crumpled and folded crudely several times, and it was sticking out from the gap at the bottom of the door. No sounds came from within the room beyond, and I assumed that 13 must be sleeping. I quietly slid my tray carefully through the flap, as to avoid disturbing the occupant behind the door, and collected the note and the breakfast tray left behind by the morning staff before creeping quietly back down to the staff room. I dared not read the note during the night, just in case its contents caused a disturbance in my mind that would affect my ability to continue working. I placed it into my satchel, noticing a strange, glistening semi-wetness on its surface, and tried to distract myself with some university work, occasionally glancing over at the bag and resisting the temptation to read Spencer's note. In the morning, I did a quick handover with the morning staff and sharply made my way back to my flat. Normally, I would go straight to bed and catch up on some sleep, but instead I put on a large pot of coffee and prepared some toast. Taking my breakfast and the note over to my study desk, I opened the blinds to allow the struggling December morning sun to break into the room, and then sat down and slowly unfolded the paper. Now I would be lying if I was to say that the writing on the note was anything more than childish scrawling, and at first I doubted there was anything of worth to be gleaned from the spidery scribblings. But after several minutes of study and copying words onto a fresh piece of paper, I managed to decipher enough of the contents to read. As I mentioned at the start of this account, I have long since destroyed all written documentation of these events, but I can recall enough of the note to tell you what Spencer had written. I may be embellishing the text slightly, for if you knew what I know, you would find an impossible juxtaposition between the writing and what had written it. As best as I can remember, it read roughly as follows. I apologize if I shocked you the other night or gave you a fright. Please don't feel guilty for finding my appearance shocking. I have long since grown accustomed to such reactions. I can only assume that Dr. Monroe, for whatever reason, is unavailable to look after my well-being, and it is on that assumption that I have seized upon the chance to finally have contact with someone else. I must apologize for my disgraceful and crude writing. My condition makes matters of delicacy difficult, so please be patient. I will not confuse you with the full knowledge at what is at work here, nor my condition or cause of confinement within this house. I freely admit that I do not know exactly where I am, or how much time has passed since I first came to be here, but that isn't important anymore. Unless certain measures are taken care of, I will not be long for this world, and if that happens, it can only mean Monroe has achieved his grand aim. Understand this, the man you know as Dr. Samuel Monroe is not whom he appears to be. In our youth, we were close friends, the best of friends you could say, and together we adventured and traveled among all the forgotten corners and exotic places of the world, the Orient, the Congo, and Arabia. We explored the deepest jungles of the Indian subcontinent, the ancient sands of Egypt, and the forgotten ruins of the Americas. My condition is somewhat linked to these travels, but it is something far more sinister than a mere tropical disease. Now I need to have two things from you, if I may be so bold. I realize you are under no obligation to aid me, but know that if you do, you will not only be doing me a service, but also securing the future safety of all mankind. Firstly, I need you to keep our correspondence a secret. No one, least of all Monroe, must suspect we are in contact. That man is wicked and will seek to do you harm should he discover you have been talking with me. Secondly, I will need you to acquire some items that have been taken from me. Unfortunately, I believe them to be in Monroe's possession. I will tell you more about these once I have received a reply from you. Only then can we move things forward. I am thankful to whatever powers allowed our paths to cross and look forward to hearing from you. The note was fascinating. I reread it several times as my coffee and toast lay forgotten amidst the dozens of questions now burning through my mind. I could not be certain that it was even meant for me, but somehow I grew convinced that it was. The eloquence of the writing was in total contrast to the manner in which it was presented, but it clearly came from a vibrant and sharp mind. As intelligent as the author may have been, it was clear that Spencer was disturbed in some way. There was little doubt that the letter had cast a dark shadow over Dr. Monroe's conduct. Just what sort of wickedness was Spencer implicating the doctor in? True, the man was unfriendly, cold even, and more than a little abrupt. But would he really seek to cause me harm, should he find out I was in contact with Spencer? I simply could not give the idea credence. I was quite certain, at this point at least, that the whole affair regarding Spencer's dislike of Monroe was a delusional fantasy, conjured up by Spencer in the isolation of his attic confinement. After all, was it not only natural for someone with a mental disturbance to project a demonic persona upon those whom he saw as his jailer? Fantasy or not, I decided to follow the advice given to me and not alert Dr. Monroe to my contact with Spencer, if only out of a desire to keep my job as opposed to any kind of fear of physical harm. I wrote a reply that morning and took it up to Spencer when I started my next night shift. Suffice to say, I had agreed to hear him out, but only on the sole condition that he told me all he knew about his illness, so that I could use that knowledge to benefit medical science. Of course, what I was truly hoping for was a unique case to focus my academic studies and career around, and I'm sure on some level Spencer suspected that. Before sliding my reply under the door, I first attempted to make verbal contact. I pressed my head close against the door and simply said, "It's me. I got your note." No reply came. I continued with, "How did you know I would get it?" And, "Can you hear me?" My last question was cut off by a loath, bubbling, gurgling sound, a liquid response that brought bile up to my throat. I fled once more, almost as keenly as on that first night I saw those terrible eyes, and confined myself once again to the staff room, where a cold sweat prevented me from gaining any meaningful rest. Early the next morning, I rushed upstairs before the morning staff came in, and to my relief, there was another note waiting for me. This second letter was shorter than the first, and as I was more accustomed to his writing, I was able to quickly read over it before the day staff arrived. Although shorter, this note was more revealing, and it opened the doorway to the chaotic madness which eventually followed. Overwhelmed to hear that you will aid me. I am a little unsure if you are ready for all that I have to say, but you must be, for my sake, but also for yours. Before that, though, I must address a few things. Last night I was unable to respond to your questions. I did try, but as you no doubt heard, my vocal skills have atrophied to the point of uselessness. I appreciate your keen interest in my condition. I am flattered that you would consider trying to offer treatment or a cure, but I am afraid I am far beyond that. Perhaps a bathe in the waters of Lake Hali in Carcosa, or the medicine of the star scientists of distant Yugath, might avail me, but mere terrestrial treatment is useless. My affliction is just that, a punishment handed down by callous forces that occasionally take an interest in our race. Never to our benefit and always to our misery. No, I am beyond help, but I thank you for the gesture. The items I mentioned in my last letter are as follows. My diary that I kept up until my imprisonment and a manuscript. The latter is of the most importance. Its title is De Vermis Mysterious. Both should be in Monroe's home. You must find a way to get both back to me here as quickly as you can. The next few days dragged on. I knew what Spencer wanted me to do, but I was undecided if I was capable of committing a crime to get him what he wanted. Clearly, he was delusional. There could be no doubt of that. But I was still so keen to learn more about him. Despite his words, I was sure his condition could benefit from study, and it was only the continued imprisonment by Dr. Monroe that stopped the medical community from offering him any kind of aid. I wasn't fully ready to burgle a man's home on the request of a madman, and besides, Dr. Monroe was still off work with a virus, making a midnight trip to his home a risky endeavor. I had no reason to call on him in a social capacity, and I doubted he would even recognize me as a work colleague. Such were the man's ways. I maintained a relaxed correspondence with Spencer, avoiding a direct answer to his request, and instead probing further into his and Dr. Monroe's past. Eventually he grew impatient, and our brief notes started to turn into bitter circular arguments. Spencer's illness appeared to worsen, and he was growing nervous. I was unwilling to rush headlong into a decision regarding recovering his notes and manuscript, and this provoked in him a string of notes filled with venomous scoldings. I admit that during this time I considered dropping the matter entirely and returning to my previous routine of university work, and considered quitting Byron House altogether. Before deciding one way or the other, however, I took it upon myself to do some research without telling Spencer. I didn't have a lot to go on, but I made a trip into the nearby town of Eastwich and consulted the modest library there. I searched for anything that mentioned a Lake Hallie, Carcosa, Yuggoth, Divermis Mysterious, and all the other nonsense words that had appeared in Spencer's notes. Of Lake Hallie and Yuggoth there was nothing. No text on geography, history, science, astronomy, or any other subject known to man contained a reference to either of these words. Divermis Mysterious was a more successful area of study, and I learned a great deal about this forbidden and cursed tome. It was written in the year 1542 by one Ludwig Prynne, shortly before his death at the hands of the Inquisition. Various translations and copies had been made throughout history, many with strange titles such as the Grimoire or the Saracenic Rituals. Its original Latin title, however, was ominous, translating into something akin to the Mysteries of the Worm. The book seemed to be one of several interconnected volumes, each more hideous in subject matter and scope. Other works were mentioned in the text, books such as Culte de Ghoul, Things of the Water, and that final and most dreadful work of black magic, the Necronomicon. Each book spoke of strange places and strange times, whole cycles of myth, where the earth had been ruled over by old ones and elder things, of the malevolent fungi from Yuggoth, of the faceless night gaunts, and of the black goat with 1,000 young, of great Cthulhu, who lay dead, but dreaming in lightless, brine-soaked R'lyeh. I freely admit that most of the works were mercifully beyond my understanding, but still there was an awful sincerity to their descriptions. I pushed such thoughts from my mind. After all, I was at that time a man of science, not sorcery. Still, they lingered in my imagination and have continued to do so every day since. After hours of searching, I also came across a small paragraph in a recently written history book about witchcraft regarding the reign of Queen Elizabeth I that mentioned a certain John Dee as a sorcerer and author of such works as Monas Hieroglyphica and Notes on the Mysteries of the Worm. I made a note of the book's author, a Dr. Harlan Glass, and penned a letter to him the next day, asking if he knew anything about a book called Divermis Mysteriis, but I never received a reply. What kind of forbidden study had Spencer and Monroe been involved in? I had always assumed the doctor to be a rational man, but if Spencer were to be believed, he has once a keen scholar of the supernatural, an explorer of strange, dark places. The day in the library had taxed my mind, and I returned to my flat for an early night's sleep. My dreams, however, were far from restful. I was plagued by a reoccurring nightmare of the first time I had seen Spencer's strange eyes. Chaotic vortices burned into my mind, and I found myself floating through the vast void of space. I knew not how I came to be in the ether, but I had a vague sense of possessing no body, and of being carried on the back of something so sinister I dared not look. The beating of huge wings deafened my ears, and although I had no idea where in space I was, I instinctively knew I was bound for lightless Yuggoth, the outpost of the dread sentient fungi. Then my nightmare scene shifted, and I found myself standing at the edge of what I knew must be Lake Hallie in Carcosa, dark purple waters lapping languidly around my ankles, thick like syrup but with the stench of 1,000 rotting corpses. Something huge and horrifying rotated slowly in the center of the lake. a colossal tower of plastic flesh that to my horror possessed the mockery of a face upon its surface, and eyes too, the swollen, bulging eyes of Spencer. I awoke suddenly, screaming and short of breath. My sheets were damp with cooling sweat and my head throbbed in pain. I took a week off work to recover, but the nightmares continued to assault me on a nightly basis. Eventually, December came to a close, and Christmas came and went with little fuss. I've never been one to overly celebrate the so-called festive period and spend most of my time alone in my flat or in the local pub. When I did finally return to Byron House, I discovered that Dr. Monroe had also returned to work and was looking a lot healthier, having finally beaten the virus, and he was back to his usual, aloof self. I was somewhat relieved, as his presence made contact with Spencer impossible and beyond my control, something even he would be forced to accept, as it seemed he was as afraid of Monroe discovering our contact as I was. I wasted little time. By now, I had become obsessed with gaining more knowledge about De Vermis Mysterious and its contents. I didn't for 1 second believe that anything I had seen in my dreams or read in various books on necromancy and witchcraft to be true, but rather, I saw it as a means of further understanding more about Spencer. My desire to write a paper on him had been renewed by my sudden plunge into his supernatural interests, and I felt confident I could write a groundbreaking work on supernatural monomania and hand it in confidently to my tutor. I had finally decided to go ahead with Spencer's wish and steal back his diary and manuscript, not to hand over to him, of course, but for my own personal study. Once I was done, I could simply sell the book and make a bit of cash in the process. By all accounts, it would be worth a fortune to the right buyer. I knew my time at Byron House was coming to an end. First semester exams were looming, and I would need to quit my job in order to focus on my studies. In a few weeks, I would be away from Monroe and Spencer and back into the sanity of regular student life. Greedy for knowledge, I therefore decided that breaking the law was worth the risk and set about planning my theft. I started to follow Monroe home on my days off. Despite recovering from his illness, he seldom stayed the night over at Byron House. No doubt he was still recovering on some level and wished to sleep in his own bed. This would make things difficult, of course, but I was confident his stubbornness would cause him to quickly lapse back into his old habits. I would wait for him just out of sight and then carefully shadow the man until I became familiar with his routine. Fortunately, he did as I suspected he would and started spending more time at Byron House. Eventually, I chose a night to break into his home. It was a freezing January night when I made my way over to Monroe's large detached house on Town Court Lane. The night was clear and painfully chilling, and the moon and stars were shining down brightly from the void above, momentarily bringing back memories of my recent nightmares. I won't make too much of an ordeal about my burglary, and I'm certainly not proud of it. Despite being a total amateur, I managed to scale the large brick wall at the back of the residence, and using my jacket wrapped around my hand, punched my way through a small glass plate fitted into the kitchen door. Wasting no time, I pulled out my pocket torch and systematically searched the downstairs rooms. It wasn't long before I came upon a study. There was a strong musk permeating the whole room, which I attributed to the stuffed animals and ancient tomes that littered the walls. Hundreds of large, heavy books were held up by sagging shelves that almost seemed to creak and moan under the weight. I searched the largest of the bookshelves, trying my best to find the tome I needed. The books were in no order and heaped upon each other in a haphazard fashion. Among the mundane volumes on history, anthropology, and geography, there sat several dark and sinister texts that I had seen mentioned in my time at the Eastwich Library. There was Unaussprechlichen Kulten of von Junst, Conte der Letz Kult de Ghoul, and the dreaded Saleno fragments. Most of these forbidden texts appeared to be modern translations, but at least one of was frighteningly authentic and ancient. It didn't take me long to find De Vermis Mysterious. I slid the crumbling manuscript out of the shelf carefully. The remaining books gently toppled into the vacant space it left behind. I doubted if Monroe would even notice a particular volume missing in all this chaotic cataloging, but I quickly rearranged the shelf, so no noticeable gaps were present. I noticed another, slimmer black-bound volume tied to the back of manuscript, and a quick check confirmed this to be Spencer's diary. I silently praised Monroe's sense of propriety. Despite his disorderly collection, he must have known how important Spencer's diary and notes on the manuscript were. Unable to contain my curiosity, I opened De Vermis Mysteries and glanced over the spidery text inside. Unfortunately, the manuscript was far too complex to decipher, with its archaic Latin, and so I concentrated instead on the more accessible, but no less mysterious journal. I was confident that Monroe would not return home, and the house had no close neighbors. So by the light of my pocket torch, I sat at the study's large desk and read. The journal detailed the various travels that Monroe and Spencer had undertaken as young men, and it appeared that the latter had been true to his word in his note describing these adventures. The diary spoke of an ancient cult that the two had come into contact with during their sojourn in Central Asia, a place, or perhaps even a time, known only as Leng. It also spoke of a secret order of undying monks who guarded a fabulous treasure that lay in the center of a great stone monastery. This treasure, a large golden idol of a winged hound, was a powerful artifact, capable of opening the way for the old ones locked beyond our reality. They guarded this treasure from all would-be thieves, such as the fearsome Cho-Cho, a race of semi-human cannibals, as well as the dreaded spiders of Leng, sentient arachnids with their own designs for mankind. The old ones appeared to be Monroe's main motivation concerning the cult. In particular, he appeared to be opposed to them in some way. Spencer seemed much more interested in the cult's mysterious powers. As I read on, I learned more about their dealings with the monks and the secrets of immortality that they could induct outsiders into. It seemed that Spencer did indeed get his wish and meet the deathless leaders of the group, but that the meeting had gone sour, and in retaliation, he decided to steal the golden idol and make his escape. Monroe was reluctant to go with him, but being guilty by association, was forced to flee for his life. During the trip back to England, the two had been in constant disagreement as to the idol's fate. Monroe wanted to be rid of the thing, but Spencer refused, saying that the black secrets contained within would allow them to live forever, as gods upon the earth. At some point, the two parted ways, Monroe with the idol and Spencer with nothing. He grew deeply paranoid and furious with Monroe's departure, and became convinced that either the cult or Monroe had placed a curse on him, and spoke first of the symptoms that no doubt manifested into his current condition. I tried my best to locate the idol, which was drawn on a diary page with great detail, but my efforts were fruitless. I suspected that Monroe may still possess it, but that it must have been hidden somewhere in his house, or even his office at Byron. Regardless, it was time for me to leave. I didn't sleep well after reading Spencer's diary. The nightmares grew more vivid and intense. I felt as if I was being plunged into gloomy Erebus, my tormented soul nightly assaulted by every blasphemous revelation that the diary had revealed. The morning I was due to attend my last shift at Byron House, I sat and pondered over an untouched cup of coffee. I had read much in the past few weeks, and although I was certain that the whole matter of magic and old gods and Yuggoth was purely fanciful, I couldn't detach a dreadful sense of realness from the topics I had read. If everything written down in that diary was true, then it would appear that Monroe had put a stop to Spencer's plans of immortality and locked him up in the attic to cease whatever menace he may have been to mankind. Due to my nightmares, however, I was quickly growing tired with the whole affair. It was taxing my mind to breaking point, and my studies had suffered because of it. I reasoned that if some insane inmate wanted his books back, who was I to deny him? Better to be rid of the things and banish all thoughts of elder gods and old ones from my mind and get back into my studies, forget about the whole thing and my involvement in it. Secretly, I had thought about putting the books back in Monroe's house, but it had been clear that he knew about the burglary due to the smashed window I left behind. He seemed to be spending more time at home now, and I heard a rumor that he had acquired a rather large German shepherd to guard his home. Having possession of the books would clearly mark my guilt. On the off chance he suspected me, the local police would not have to search my tiny flat long to find them. I could have discarded them, but that felt irresponsible, given their contents. Plus, my fingerprints would be all over them. Selling them was an option, and my original plan. But I pondered upon what kind of person would be interested in obtaining the book, and to what purpose. Plus, they could still be traced back to me. You may think I was being paranoid, but at the time I did not want to risk the chance, no matter how unlikely, that I could be linked to criminal activity. I snuck the manuscript in Spencer's diary into one of my folders and went to work. At the earliest opportunity, when the other staff were busy and there was a lull in activity, I marched up to the attic, and after a moment's hesitation, I placed both the diary and the De Vermis Mysteries in front of the door and knocked once before briskly leaving. I worked sporadically at Byron House from then on. I had planned to quit, but a few extra shifts came my way, and I was in no position to turn down the money. I found a way to juggle the work with my studies, and I took day shifts only. Slowly, the nightmares stopped, and I was able to get adequate rest. I looked forward to passing my exams and starting a new semester at university, and it felt as if normality was returning to my life. However, I noticed a strange change in Monroe as the days went by. He was showing signs of severe stress and appeared to be growing weaker as time passed. The virus that had plagued him a few weeks ago appeared to be back, and I even saw him cough up a small measure of blood into his handkerchief. His entire demeanor took on a somber appearance. Great black rings formed around his eyes, and deep wrinkles appeared to be manifesting upon his brow. Not only did he come across as a man ravaged by illness, but also a man worried out of his mind. He was less abrasive than usual, and even attempted to make some light conversation with the other staff in an almost resigned and defeated way. Eventually, he got so ill that he once again had to leave work, only this time he never came back. We received the news a few days later that Dr. Monroe had died of heart failure, nothing unusual given his age and recent stress, but still it unnerved me greatly. His death plagued my mind, for if what I dared suspect was true, then I had somehow played a part in his death, and so had Spencer with that damned manuscript. Now, James, we are coming to the end of my story. It has taken a while to get to this point, and I admit that I may have stretched out the affair longer than I intended. If I have, it is only because I dread writing that which must be written down. It is the only way you will understand. As I did at the start of this account, I now urge you to consider not involving yourself any further in this matter. Put the occult and witchcraft far to the back of your mind. There are things mankind cannot know. Black magic is truly the devil's work, James. If you are so inclined, you can do your own research on the history of Byron House. If you do so, you will learn that one February evening around 60 years ago, the house was burned down to its foundations, with only one casualty. You may also learn, too, that not long after, Dr. Monroe's house was broken into, and a large portion of his private book collection burned to ashes on his back lawn. No one was ever caught for these crimes. There were suspects, of course, disgruntled ex-employees, former inmates, perhaps even a naive and young orderly studying psychiatry at the University of Manchester. But the police failed to ever nail down a perpetrator. I am an old man now, and my mind is not as sharp as it once was. Nevertheless, I will recount the horror as full as I can, and maybe then you will give up this investigation of yours. Once a month, the staff and inmates at Byron took a trip into the countryside as a reward for good behavior, so that everyone could benefit from some good old-fashioned fresh air. Spencer was exempt from these trips, of course, due to his physical limitations, and would have normally stayed behind with Dr. Monroe, whilst the rest of the house went out. However, with Monroe gone, none of the staff were willing to stay behind to see to Spencer's needs, and instead a tray of food was to be left outside of his attic door. The staff and inmates then left the house for a few days. I had made it clear that my college studies needed some serious tending too, and I would be unable to work at Byron House any longer. I left not long after Dr. Monroe passed away, and never stayed in contact with Jane, Williams, or anyone else from the house. Confident that one of the fellows I now shared my student accommodation with in Manchester could provide me with an alibi should I have need of one, I took the train from Piccadilly to Eastwich. I then took the last bus to Barton, and I waited for Williams, Jane, and the various inmates they looked after to leave the premises and allow me to make a concealed entry. It was with a heavy heart and a troubled mind that I once again ascended those lonely, sinister steps that led to the attic. By this time, the nightmares had returned, only now they featured the tormented spirit of Monroe, crying to me from beyond the grave. I admit to you fully that I may have been in the grip of madness myself at this time, for what sane man would have done what I did on that chill February night? I was convinced that the fate of all mankind was at stake, that Leng and Yugoth and Carcosa were all very much real, and that the old ones waited patiently in their ancient prisons to descend once more upon the earth. I cannot say to you that I do not still believe these things, but that is my burden, not yours. As I summed up all the courage I could muster and stood before the door, a voice slurred forth from beyond. To this day I cannot say if I truly heard these words, or if they just appeared in my mind, but those liquid syllables, slimy and slopping, spoke to me, and I dared not answer back. You, done well, the key mine. Monroe denied, killed him, called it down from the stars. Ritual, soul is nectar to the gods. It fed of him. Elder ones feast now. Monroe burns, body returning. Freedom, your help, you're next. My head spun with confusion and my heart pounded with fear. In one mad burst of fury, I kicked down the door and gazed upon that which had once been Jonathan Spencer. What did I see? It's difficult to truly describe with justifiable detail. But what I did see caused me to flee the attic in a fit of howling madness and return with petrol and matches. Whatever it was, I was convinced that only the purifying touch of fire could erase its horrid monstrosity from the world. For floundering on the attic floor there laid a vast mass of gelatinous, rotting, fungoid flesh, quivering under the weight of its own hideousness. Parts of it lay splashed upon the ceiling and the walls, but the bulk laid upon the bare attic floor in bubbling pools. Unblinking, bulbous eyes rolled around the shuddering mound before locking upon me with the intensity of a dying star. Appendages and pseudo-appendages formed and spurted up from within, only to collapse into mounds of hideous protoplasmic tissue that continued to squirm of their own accord. I think I saw a face, or at least the parts of a face, crawling somewhere upon the surface of that blasphemous bulk. It was a rancid thing that had labored under the curse of Leng for more than half a century, a blob of squirming meat that was the laughing, gibbering, mocking form of Jonathan Spencer, inmate number 13, the shambler in the attic. My job is watching a woman trapped in a room. Part 2.
I had to do something, and I had to do it right now. If Melanie was somehow a fake, that meant they must have sent her. And if they sent her, that meant they knew. They knew about the messages in her painting. They knew about me asking questions. And they knew I didn't hit a button during any of it. I felt panic and fear crawling up my chest, making it hard to breathe. Standing up, I started pacing, periodically glancing back at the monitor to see if Rachel could help me, tell me what I needed to do next. But she had laid down on her bed. It was hard to tell for sure with her back to the camera, but I think she was crying. No, I needed to fix this. Get her out of there. And if I didn't have a better plan, I'd just have to go with the one I already had. Feeling the hard eye of the ceiling camera on me, I went to the door and stepped back into the locker room. My phone was in my locker, and after messing up the combination the first time, I got the door open and got it out. Gripping it tightly, I tried to hold it by my side casually, but I knew there was little point. If they knew everything, I wasn't going to be able to hide anything. I just had to try and be fast, get some kind of message out to people that could help Rachel before they got to me. I opened the camera on the phone as I re-entered the surveillance room and hit record. It made a small beeping noise, and once I was sure it was recording, I turned the camera on myself. My name is Tommy. Thomas Calhoun. And my job is watching a woman trapped in a room. This is not a joke or a movie or whatever. This is real. For 3 years my job is to sit in this room. I moved the camera slowly around the room, taking in the door to the bathroom, the water cooler, the desk with the monitors, keyboard, and button box, and watch a video feed of a woman locked up in a bedroom somewhere. I stepped closer to the desk and made sure the monitor showing Rachel was clear and in focus. I didn't know this woman was a prisoner at first, or I tricked myself into thinking she wasn't because the money was good. Either way, I know she is now. She is in danger, and so am I. After lingering on video of her for a few more seconds to make sure every detail could be seen, I turned the camera back on myself. I had to hurry, or the video might be too big to send quickly. I was trying to stay calm, but I felt myself tearing up as I went on, and I did my best to keep my words clear. Please help her. I don't know where she is. I don't know who has her, because I don't know who I really work for. But they are bad people and she is not safe. All I know is that I work at a building at, redacted, right outside of San Antonio. Per no sleep rules, to be clear, this address is not real. I only know the names of 2 other people connected to this place. The man who hired me, Mr. Solomon. And a man who might have a job like mine, Charlie Jeffers, Jeffries I think. I don't know if they are real people. I don't know if that is their real names. Please. I'm not crazy. I know how this sounds. Just come here, see the room. Figure out where she is and help her. Anne. I heard the muffled sound of the outer door opening into the locker room, and I frantically fumbled with the phone to stop the recording. How do I send? Oh no, how do I? There it is. I hit the button to share, and felt a new panic rising. Who should I send it to? I had only a handful of contacts, and I just selected them all. Maybe at least one of them would take it seriously and get help. As I heard the door to the surveillance room opening behind me, I hit send. Not connected to data service or Wi-Fi. Please send again when connected. What? No. I turned to see Mr. Solomon entering the room. He was flanked by 2 large men in dark suits that looked like bodyguards or something. Raising a finger, he wagged it at me. No service in here, Thomas. But then you should never need service in here, so long as you followed the rules. They took me easily. I tried to make it to the bathroom and close the door, but the 2 guards stopped me and pulled me down. They put the, what do you call them? Zip ties on my hands and feet and pulled a black bag over my head. Then I was being carried out of the room, and it felt like they must have put me in the back of a van that was pulled right up to the building. I was laying on what felt like thin, weird-smelling carpet that covered a hard metal layer underneath. I heard someone get into the van with me, and I asked where we were going. If they would just take me and let Rachel go. There was a short laugh overhead, and then Mr. Solomon's voice as he told me that he would explain everything when we got where we were going. For now, he said, I needed to relax. It was a long drive and I would need the rest. I went to say more, but then I felt a sharp pain in my neck. They had stabbed me, or, no, they injected me with something. I was feeling so strange now, but I had to stay awake. I had to try and get away, I had to. Hello again, Thomas. I blinked as I began looking around. My mouth was dry and my head hurt, but otherwise I felt okay. I wasn't tied up anymore. Instead, I was laying back on a padded table like I'd seen when I went to the doctor. But this wasn't a doctor's office. The room was large, and aside from the padded table, it held a small bed, a desk with a computer monitor on it, and a couple of chairs. Sitting in one of those chairs was Mr. Solomon. I raised up slowly, blinking at him. Where is she? Is Rachel okay? The man smiled. You really are something, Thomas. Trying to be the hero, even if you don't quite know how. I respect that. Licking his lips, he leaned forward slightly. In fact, I respect that so much that I've decided to start our new relationship with as much honesty as I'm allowed. Some of my colleagues disagree with this approach, but you know what? Fuck them. This is my project, and I think you deserve to know what's going on. Looking more serious, he stood up, lifting the gun he had been holding casually in his lap. But before we get into the details, would you like to see Rachel? I slid off the table and nodded as I caught myself from falling. My legs were still wobbly from whatever they had given me, but I barely noticed. Yes, please. Let me see her. The real her. Mr. Solomon gave a small laugh and gestured toward a nearby door. Yes, reality is always best. She's just there in the next room. I stumbled my way forward, my legs getting better as I walked, and when I grabbed the doorknob, it turned easily. I expected the door to lead to her bedroom, but instead it opened into another room a lot like the one I had been in, though the stuff in it was different. Strange machines filled the walls, and in the back of the room was a large aquarium. I didn't know. It was a big cylinder taller than I was, and it was filled with some kind of gray liquid. There was a shape in that liquid. Go ahead, Thomas. Feel free to go have a good look. You've earned it. I felt my stomach clenching tighter at Mr. Solomon's words and the meanness in them. My legs felt heavy again now, but it wasn't from the drugs this time. Shuffling forward, I could see the shape was a person. Oh no, or at least a body, because it was clear from just looking at it that the person was dead. It was very well preserved, but I could see how the skin hung wrong and looked bloated in spots. Oh God, no, its hair, which had been floating like seaweed in front of its face, drifted away as I reached the glass, and I could see Rachel staring out at me. Murderer. I turned on Solomon and started to run toward him when he shot me. Suddenly I was on the ground convulsing as he stepped closer. Don't worry, Thomas. It won't kill you. Just make you unable to move much for a bit. I heard more footfalls as my body began to still. Get him up, take him back to the other room. I could barely feel anything as I was carried back to the padded table and propped up into a sitting position. This time I was strapped down, but I guessed it was more so I didn't fall off, because I couldn't move anything other than my head, and even at just a little. I could hardly see at all for crying, but I recognized the blurry shape of Solomon sitting back down in front of me. Before you ask, well, when you are able to ask anything again, yes, that is Rachel. Not a fake Rachel, not a dummy, and not some kind of trick. As I said, the time for tricks is past. Now is the time for truth. Frowning slightly, he went on. Thomas, I understand that showing you her body that way, might seem very cruel. You may hate me for it right now. I would understand it if you did. But you called me a murderer, and at least in this specific context, I think that is unfair, because I didn't kill Rachel. In truth, I've been with this aspect of the project for only 7 years. He gestured back to the door behind him. And Rachel has been dead for over 8. I felt my eyes widen as though they belonged to someone else's body. It was more lies. More tricks. All of it. Oh God, it had to be. Do you know what remote viewing is? He rolled his eyes. Sorry, right, you can't talk right now. I'll just assume you don't. Remote viewing is a broad term for the ability to see things that are far away from you physically, to know things you shouldn't be able to know through your normal five senses. Some describe it as a psychic ability, though there are several schools of thought as to how and why it works. His eyes fixed on mine intently. Because it does work, Thomas. Various governments and private organizations have studied it for a very long time, and while publicly it is always ridiculed as pseudoscience and foolish superstition, the reality is that some people have the innate ability, that means it comes naturally, to somehow see other places. Rachel was one of those people. She came into the program when she was 17, having been identified via a front-facing screening process that was ran as a psychological test that paid subjects well at a time when Rachel was looking to make some money. 3 months after being identified as a good candidate, she was taken, and after the initial adjustment period, she became a largely compliant asset that quickly rose to the top of our talent pool. Solomon folded his hands on his knee. I know you cared for her, Thomas, so I think this is worth sharing. Rachel was never treated badly, other than her confinement and the occasional test that was mildly unpleasant. No, we all treasured her. She was enormously talented, not just as a remote viewer, but as an artist. That's how she would convey what she saw, you understand. She would enter into an almost trance-like state when she painted, and when she was done, she would have given us a painting of images and words that provided, well, it was very valuable information. He chuckled. If you ever wondered, that's why there was always such care that the paintings were never shown to the camera. Picking at his pants, he went on. Rachel was so talented that she was selected for a new program that we thought might greatly enhance or alter her ability. We introduced something foreign into her body. At first, nothing seemed to change. If anything, the accuracy of her remote viewing was declining, which was a problem for us and for her. But then we realized that we were reading the new paintings wrong. She was able to see more clearly than ever. She just was no longer bound to only current events. Now her sight transcended time. He paused, and I realized he was enjoying telling the story. The bastard was having a good time, pausing to make it more dramatic. I would fucking kill him. While this made some of her paintings less immediately useful, they became much more valuable as we were able to decipher them. For a time, it looked as though everything was working better than we had ever hoped. His lips thinned. And then, one day, she showed a painting to the camera. It said, "Please help me, Thomases." This immediately sent up all kinds of red flags. She knew not to show paintings to the camera, and now she was trying to communicate with someone. We didn't disrupt her routine, but an intensive investigation began into who she was talking to. Was it one of her handlers? One of the technicians? Someone from her past life? But nothing checked out. Leaning back in his chair, a look of pride grew on Solomon's face as he continued. I was the one that first suggested the idea that she was, intentionally or not, knowingly or not, seeing and talking to someone in the future. I was still an outside consultant at the time, but by that point we had more strange behaviors from her, including the second message painting, "That girl isn't me." My theory made some sense, but it very quickly ran into a greater obstacle. The introduction of the foreign material had not been as seamless as we had hoped, despite her having been stable for almost 3 years since it was implanted. Whether it was due to her increasing emotional upset and stress, or simply the passage of time, she suddenly began to deteriorate. Her work became more erratic and hard to understand as her body began to decline. We were monitoring her health closely, but it didn't matter. 5 days after she painted "That Girl Isn't Me," she suddenly went into cardiac arrest and died. Somewhat inexplicably, we were unable to resuscitate her. The man sighed. This was a great loss. And it required adjustments of my theory. Based on everything we knew, it still made sense that she was talking to someone. Someone with access to the camera feed, and very likely someone named Thomas. If Thomas was viewing that camera footage in the future, as I believed, then he must be working for us in the future. He gave me a thin smile. And whether you believe that the future is set in stone or not, I'm all for giving it a helping hand. 7 years ago I began the Thomas Project. Over the course of that time I have overseen the screening and hiring of 43 men named Thomas at several different sites, all with one very specific job. To watch the videos of Rachel from just before her implant to the time of her death. I tried to speak, but my mouth still wouldn't work. I wanted to say he was lying, that it didn't make sense, that it was another trick, but I think I wanted to hear it more for myself. Because I didn't think he was lying. I didn't think it was a trick. And I thought I was starting to understand. The point wasn't really them watching the videos, of course. It was how they reacted to watching the videos. What they did, and how that matched up with what Rachel had done in response in the past. 13% quit after the first day. 38% hit either the red or the green button after the first message asking for help and saying their name. 22% attempted to contact the authorities before reaching the stage where Melanie was introduced. He shook his head slightly. I wish I could take credit for her introduction, but it wasn't my suggestion. We assumed from the "that girl isn't me" message that there was a double of Rachel introduced to you at some point, perhaps to kill you or dissuade you or find out what you knew. But it took a few tries until we felt it was well refined, and as I've pointed out, only 27% made it that far. And all of them failed the next test. He pointed at me. Her name. You see, the girl you've been watching, that talented, wonderful girl whose body is preserved in the next room. Her name was Rachel Donovan. I had always wondered if Rachel was merely seeing you, or if there was some kind of connection between the two of you. When you called Melanie Rachel, I knew that we had finally found the right Thomas, that distant point of light that our Rachel was looking at across space and time. I swallowed thickly and found I could feel my tongue, if only a little. Slurring badly, I pushed out a single word. W-I. Solomon looked surprised. I'd have thought that'd be clear by now. You're our only remaining link to one of our greatest treasures. Perhaps you have a similar ability, or it may be that she forged the link purely through her own talent and will. But either way, you are important and you have more work to do. He stood up and moved over to the table where he turned on the monitor. As it came to life, I saw it was a frozen image of Rachel's roommate tape paused where I had left off watching. Turning back to me, the man looked solemn. You have to watch the rest of it. Because Rachel painted you more pictures before she died, and we have to know what they mean. I spent the next 5 days watching Rachel die. From the outside, just watching the monitor, it didn't seem that different than what I had been watching for the past 3 years. Rachel slept, she watched TV, she read, and she painted. But there were signs if you were looking for them. She seemed tired and tense, and she had taken to sleeping more. And occasionally, just every once in a while, she would glance up at the camera, at me. It was then that I could see the fear and sadness in her eyes. Inside I felt like a burned-out house collapsing in on itself. At first I refused to watch, to do anything they wanted me to do. Solomon didn't get mad at me, but just shrugged. He said while cooperation was preferred and could go a long way toward making my stay with them more comfortable, it wasn't required. If he was right, Solomon said with a thin smile, things would play out as they were meant to, regardless of what I wanted or thought I chose. Either way, he added, the video was about to start back playing and would not stop for another 5 days. Whether I wanted to spend that time getting to see her again was entirely up to me. I tried to not watch, but a part of me knew from the start I was going to. Maybe I would find some clue that they were lying about her being dead. Or Rachel could give me some advice or warning about what I needed to do next. I didn't know. What I did know is that I couldn't miss the chance to see her again. And despite knowing in my heart that she was dead and everything on the video had happened a long time ago, I still felt that by watching I was with her somehow. She had been taken away from everything she knew when she was barely grown, trapped for years just for being special. Experimented on. Treated like property. Kept from ever having friends or family or a life. And yet through all that, she was still beautiful. Not just on the outside, but on the inside too. I had spent years watching her, getting to know her in 1,000 tiny ways that so few people ever truly know each other. I had seen her kindness and grace in her actions, even when she was fighting against the people holding her. I had watched her strength when she woke up day after day in her prison and never gave up. And I saw the beauty of her soul in her paintings, full of swirling colors and, what was the word, wonder. She was able to paint these things she saw with such care and love, despite living in a world that had abandoned her so completely. Well, I wasn't abandoning her. I would watch every bit of the video I could manage. Try to burn into my memory every frame of her I saw. Not for them and their stupid project. But for me. And for her. I may not have much left to do in my life before they lock me away somewhere or kill me, but I could do this one last thing. Rachel wouldn't die alone. I watched nearly all of it, stopping only to eat quickly and use the bathroom until the last 2 days. I would ask the guards to pause it, but they would only shake their heads and say Solomon said it had to play normally until it was finished. By the 4th day, I was in a stupor. I had already dozed some the first 3 days, but when I woke up on the 4th day, I could tell a few hours had passed. There were 2 trays of food on the bed, one breakfast and another lunch. I looked back at the screen in a panic, worrying I had missed something, but Rachel seemed to be just waking up too. I noticed her putting her hand to her stomach as she got out of bed and felt my own stomach twist. She was already hurting. Rachel glanced at the camera and tried to smile before moving to set up a new canvas for painting. This was the second of 3 paintings she did in those last days. The first had been the inside of an old-fashioned movie theater from the viewpoint of someone sitting in a back row. On the movie screen was just the image of a sledgehammer propped against a brick wall. I didn't understand what it meant, and I found myself scanning the picture for some message or other clue. Eventually, I found what might be one, though I didn't understand it either. Rachel must have come to understand they knew what she was doing with the paintings and didn't want to stop her, because these last 3 she set up much closer to the camera. I was still squinting and studying the painting closely when I realized the flipped-up seats in the next row up had brass number plates along the front edge of the seats. Though they were upside down from the viewpoint of the painting, the angle was good enough that once I noticed them I was able to read them. 2, 43, 26, 89. I didn't understand any of it, but I committed it all to memory, focusing all my attention on the painting until she finally took it away. Even that early on I could tell painting was taking a lot out of her now, and like I had for so long, I found myself talking to her, telling her to go rest before I remembered her body in the next room. I almost stopped then, but no. Maybe she couldn't tell I was talking to her, or maybe she could. Either way, me talking to her couldn't hurt, and it made me feel a little less lonely and sad as I watched her. The second painting, the one she started after I woke up from falling asleep for a few hours, was stranger than the rest. It looked like it was in a room with curved walls made of tree roots, and in the center of the room was a little table made out of the same stuff. Some of the roots around the room were a deep red, but other parts, including the table thing, looked burned and black. I looked closer and saw that I could see a person's shadow over the table, hands holding some long oval-shaped bundle. I studied it for a long time, going over it again and again in my mind after she took it away. I couldn't make sense of it. Of any of it. I wasn't smart enough, and I was failing her. Rachel slept for a long time after that painting. Then she got up on the 5th day, her last day, and immediately started working again. This time she was painting faster, and while I saw her wince occasionally, she never lost her look of determination as she slashed lines and colors across the canvas. When she was done, Rachel picked up the painting and turned it toward the camera, giving me a small, tired smile as she was blocked from view. It was looking out from the front porch of a house somewhere. It was out in the country, and the morning view of the yard and the land beyond were wonderful, but closer up the painting was of two hands. Holding on to each other tightly, their interlocked fingers seemed to glow red and orange in the light of the rising sun. I found myself crying as I looked at it. Part of it was because I didn't know what it meant, and I felt a growing sense of desperation at the thought that Rachel's last works might be wasted on me. Part was because I knew it had been 5 days, and I could sense I was close to the end. To her end. But there was something more to it than all that too. The last painting, even with everything else in my head and my heart pulling me down, gave me hope. Hope of what, I didn't know. But I started to think that maybe the only message Rachel had for me in that last painting was that somehow, somewhere, everything would be okay. Outside the edge of the painting I could see motion in the room. People hurriedly coming in with some kind of medical equipment. And then the monitor went black. "You've done well, Thomas. Very, very well." For the last 5 days of video, we had charted 1,047 microvariations in Rachel's behavior that we believed might correspond to your behavior, your reactions, and your emotional states while watching the video. Like before, the two of you remained in sync as though you were in the same room. It really is remarkable. I sat staring at Solomon. I listened to what he said, but I didn't care. I just wanted it over. Whatever this was, I just wanted it over. Clearing his throat, he went on. "That's why we've decided to move the implant from Rachel's body to your own. That's one of the many reasons we've preserved her so." The foreign body was still showing signs of life all this time, but just barely, and we were afraid to attempt removal. Our hope is that, given your connection to Rachel, it will accept you. Perhaps even thrive in you more than it ever did our girl. I was suddenly on my feet, and it was only the raising of Solomon's gun that stopped me from attacking him. "Don't you fucking talk about her like that. Like any of you gave a shit about her. I'll fucking kill you." Solomon's face darkened slightly as his lips thinned. "No, you won't. But if idle threats make you feel better, go ahead. It will only make things harder, not easier." Feeling a stab of panicked fear, I sat back down. "What is this thing you're going to put in me?" The man looked at me for several seconds before responding. "I'm tempted not to tell you after your stupid, and frankly, hurtful, outburst. But I'll be the bigger person." Letting out a small sigh, he went on. "Thomas, somewhere there is a tree. A very special tree. We suspect it is the same tree that Rachel painted for you that time, though we cannot say for sure, as we have never been able to find it. It is either hidden away very well or it is able to hide itself from those it wishes." I just looked at him, trying to kill him by just wanting it to be so. In any case, we have the next best thing. An ancient clipping from the tree. Secured at great cost and sacrifice, and studied for a long time without much success. We have, however, in recent years been given advice that this clipping could be grown in the right soil. We thought that soil was Rachel, but while it did develop further inside of her, she died before the necessary growth was finished. Leaning forward, he smiled at me. "We have it on fairly good authority, however, that you might succeed where she failed. I fought them when they came, but it didn't matter. I woke up some time later with a dull ache in my chest and a small, already healing scar on my upper stomach. I didn't really feel that different other than the little bit of pain, but I knew that would change with time. Maybe I had more time than Rachel, or maybe I had less. It didn't matter. I just... Wait, what was that?" There was some kind of soft voice, coming from where? It wasn't in the room. It was in my head. I felt a thrill of excitement. Maybe this was Rachel's voice. She had somehow stayed in the tree thing they had put inside me. But no. I had never heard Rachel's voice, but I sensed this wasn't it. This voice was too delicate to really be heard or understood, and it reminded me of music coming from a distant room that you felt in the back of your mind without realizing it. It was a melody, a kind of song. But it wasn't Rachel's song. I realized with a shiver that it was the song of the thing inside of me. At first I was afraid, but that didn't last long. It wasn't trying to hurt me. It was trapped here just like I was. But it started to sing. It was time for us to be free. I stood up and walked to the door, and as I did so, the lights went out. The door in front of me clicked, and when I reached out and turned the knob in the dark, it opened easily. How was this possible? And if it could do this, why hadn't it helped Rachel get out? There was no answer, but there was also no time. I could already hear boots around the corner as the glow from flashlights began to light up the far end of the hall. They would drag me back in there. Chain me up or take this thing back out of me before we could get away. If I was ever going to get out, it had to be now. The voice was singing again, pushing me to go further into the dark, to run until we were safe. So I listened and I ran. Every door unlocked for me, every turn kept me barely out of sight. The people looking for me were barking orders over a radio, asking someone what was the hold-up on the generator kicking on. Whatever the response, the hallways stayed dark as I drifted through them, blind but not falling, lost but not being found. When I reached the final door, I opened it into a bright afternoon. My lungs burned a little at the first fresh, unrecycled air I had breathed in a week. Blinking, I waited for the voice to tell me where to go, but it had fallen silent. I closed the door as panic began to rise in my chest. All this and I would get caught because I didn't know where to go. I was outside a plain brown building in the middle of nowhere. There was a road going off to the right, and to the left there was Rachel's forest, from her first painting to me. I knew it was the same forest immediately, and not just because of it matching the paintings so closely. I had some strange sense that felt like a kind of magnetism, or how birds know which way to fly. Looking around for a second, I felt like I was being pulled when I looked again at those woods. This was right. Somehow, I knew this was the way I needed to go. So I went. I had made it to the edge of the forest when I heard the noise of men coming outside the building. I thought about hiding, but I knew it was a bad idea. They would just catch me, and I felt a drive to go deeper into the woods. I plunged ahead, running at close to a reckless speed but never tripping or stumbling as I went. I would occasionally hear a noise behind me as they spread out to search, but the sounds grew fainter as I ran. I almost thought I had lost them for good when I heard a short cough that was quickly muffled off to my left. Someone had gotten close without me knowing it. Panicking, I looked for any places I could hide. There were only bushes and trees and, over there, a well. Not just a well, but Rachel's well, with the same worn, gray stone walls capped with a weathered wooden lid. I felt a moment of happy recognition, but then it faded away. How did that help? They'd check the well if they found it, and I didn't have any way to get down in it without getting hurt or stuck. Then an idea struck me. Crouching low and staying to the brush, I moved to the well and gingerly pushed on the lid. At first it resisted, but when I pushed a bit harder, the wooden circle slid aside enough that you could clearly see someone moved it. Glancing around, I eased back into the bushes as I heard soft footfalls approaching. We need to check this out. You think he went down the well? Better hope not. He probably broke his neck if he did, and then it's our asses. I could see the two men approaching. Both of them were wearing dark body armor and carried assault rifles. The older of the two shrugged back at the other one. Better that than he was hiding in there and we didn't check. Looking irritated, the younger man nodded. I'll look. He went over to the well and shoved the wooden lid aside, causing it to clatter to the ground. Hitting a button on his rifle, a flashlight sprang to life on the barrel. He started to shine it down into the well as the other continued to look in every direction. I was worried he would see me if I moved, but I couldn't wait. I just had to stay calm. think slow and move fast. I kept expecting to hear them yell, or feel something or someone strike me in the back, but nothing came. As the afternoon light began to dim, I saw the trees thinning ahead. I was approaching a road. It looked like a normal, public road too, with several cars passing one way or the other as I walked out of the forest and up the hill to the asphalt. The idea of hitchhiking, especially this close to where they held me, was frightening, but I saw little choice. I was wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt they had given me and my own shoes, but I had no money or ID or phone. My only chance was to get far enough away that I could try and get help. I jumped slightly at the hiss of hydraulic brakes as a large semi rolled to a stop next to me. The passenger window rolled down and an older man with white hair and a graying mustache leaned over and peered down at me. "You look lost, son. You need a ride?" I looked down at the door of the truck. It had a logo that said Martinez and Sons Construction and Hauling. Below it was a cartoon man hitting a wall with a sledgehammer. Looking back up, I smiled at him. "Yes, sir, I do." I woke up 5 hours later as we pulled into a truck stop somewhere in Nevada. I had planned on staying awake the entire trip, but that had only lasted a few minutes before exhaustion overtook me. I glanced over at Oliver Martinez and he gave me a toothy grin. "I'm tired, but you were plumb tuckered out. I've got to fuel up, shower and get some grub. I'm going on to California after that. If you want to ride further, just be back here in an hour." "Sound good?" I nodded and thanked him again for the ride as I got out. I felt groggy from sleeping, but otherwise okay. I just needed to decide whether this was a good spot to ask for help or if I should ride with Martinez further. He seemed like a very nice guy, and he would probably try to help if he could, but I wanted to avoid putting more people in danger if I could help it. Looking around, I saw we were in a fairly nice little town. I decided I would go look around for a few minutes and then decide what to do. I was only 3 blocks down the street when I saw the flickering lights in the distance. It was a movie theater. As I got closer, I felt my chest tightening. It was the one from Rachel's painting. "Hey there. Welcome to the Phoenix." The guy standing at the candy counter of the theater looked a little younger than me, and while he seemed friendly enough, he also looked slightly concerned. "If you're here for the horror double feature, I'm afraid the second movie is about 30 minutes in. I can give you a half rate if you want to see it though." I shook my head and tried to not look as strange and crazy as I felt. "No, that's okay. I recognize this place from a picture a friend of mine painted. So I came in to ask if you knew anything about her." He raised his eyebrows and shrugged. "Okay, weird." He smiled and added, "Weird but interesting. Who is she?" I swallowed. "Her name is, it was, Rachel Donovan." I expected him to look surprised or excited or angry, but I could see right away the name meant nothing to him. Shaking his head, he shrugged again. "Sorry, that doesn't ring a bell. I'd say you could ask the owner, but he's on vacation this week." Nodding, I searched my mind for something else to ask, some way to make this place matter the way her other paintings had. "Is there anything unique about this place then? Its history or something?" The man grinned. "Buddy, you're clearly not from here. This place is super boring. Not just the theater, but the whole town." Frowning in thought, he added, "The only thing I know about the history of this place is that there used to be a house here that burned down. This was like in the 1920s or 30s when this wasn't even a part of town. Couldn't tell you the first thing about it beyond that, but I still bet it's the most interesting thing that's ever happened here." I let out a disappointed sigh. "Okay. Well, thanks." I turned to leave when the guy called out again. "Hey man, sorry I couldn't help more. If you come back, I'll get you a discount on a movie. Half off. If I'm not working, tell them Marshall said it was okay." I waved and tried to smile as I headed for the door with a heavy heart. "Why did you lead me here, Rachel?" What's here that will help? I was outside again, staring up at the theater's bright blinking signs as though they were going to give me some kind of secret signal, when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. There was an alley that ran alongside the theater and went behind it to something. Whatever was back there, the light of a distant security lamp cast shadows along the wall of the alley, and those shadows were moving. Instead of feeling afraid, I felt excited as I started down the alley. Rachel had led me here, and I just had to trust that there was a reason for it. Keep looking until I. The shadows were made by leaves blowing in some wind I couldn't feel. As I got to the far end of the alley, I saw there was a small backyard behind the theater surrounded by a chain-link fence, and on the other side of that fence was the tree from Rachel's painting, with its deep red twisting bark and foam of green leaves waving to and fro in the night air. I felt a surge of warmth in my chest as the distant singing began again. This was the place. The special tree that could not be found unless it wanted you to find it. It sat at the edge of a small overgrown lot surrounded on all sides by buildings and yards, somehow forgotten when whatever this land had once been was divided up, and despite its location, I had a strong sense that I was the first to see it in a very long time. Climbing the fence, I felt a jagged wire dig into my leg and rip my pants as I fell over the top. I was bleeding a little, but I hardly noticed. I could smell the tree now, and it was a rich, good smell unlike any I had smelled before. Reaching out to it, I felt the singing grow louder as I touched it. I felt stronger and less afraid then, and when I saw the light opening up at its roots, I didn't tremble, I smiled. There was a hidden tunnel under the tree. A tunnel filled with sweet-smelling air that was like the tree's smell but also different. And the tunnel wasn't dark, no, not at all. It glowed with its own golden light that called to me, urged me forward. Rain was beginning to fall as I looked around the dark lot. I had the thought that I was leaving this world behind. And I found I didn't mind that much at all. The tunnel had continued to grow, slanting down gently and tall enough that I walked in without stooping. The roots of the tree went on, woven through the dirt walls as I went deeper. I looked back and saw the tunnel had closed behind me, but I wasn't surprised. The way forward was the only way that mattered. I walked for what might have been hours, but I never felt tired or hungry. And I never worried I was lost, though I had no idea where I was or where I was going. Still, I felt a surge of happiness and excitement when I turned a corner and saw something in the tunnel ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was a brick wall, but just as I began to think I had found a dead end, the wall faded away, revealing a dark room. I paused at the edge of the tunnel, looking out at the floor of what looked like a basement. It was empty, but in the light from the tree I could make out something scratched into the floor. It was the number 2. I felt my pulse quicken as I thought back to Rachel's painting with the theater seats, and then I stepped out into the room. It was the empty basement of a house, and as I went up the stairs and opened the door, I saw that the rest of the house was empty as well. No lights were on, but bright sunlight poured in through every window, and in the distance I could hear what sounded like small waves crashing on a beach. I wanted to go out and see where I was, but I forced myself to check the house first for any people or clues. But there were none. The house was utterly bare of any sign of people other than the number scratched into the floor below. My nose tingled with salty air as I stepped outside. The house was near the beach on what I soon figured out was a small, deserted island, and I realized with little surprise that I recognized the house from Rachel's painting. As I stepped off the porch, I saw no signs of people, but I wasn't entirely alone. Because sitting some distance from the house was the tree. I knew it couldn't be the same tree as in the abandoned lot, but at the same time I knew that it was. Or at least a different part of the same tree that made the tunnels and appeared in my old world in whatever place this was. Because I had started having that thought as soon as I stepped out of the house. I didn't think this was my world. Not exactly. I could see a larger island some distance away, and it might have people on it. Hotels and cars and planes. Or it might not, as those things might not exist here. Either way, my newfound intuition was growing stronger, and I could tell that what was it called? The texture of things was different somehow, if only a little. Not bad or scary, just different. Still, after a couple of hours exploring the island and checking the house, I began to feel terribly lonely, even with the tree nearby. I decided to go back into the tunnel and keep going. The basement wall faded away as I walked up to it, and I entered the tunnels again. It was only a short time later that I found my second version of the house. Much like the first, the wall faded away into a basement, but this one was far from empty. It was a workshop of some kind, full of tools I wasn't familiar with. I glanced down and saw 43 scratched onto the floor. Who was doing that? And why? I was going to explore the house more carefully this time, as it looked like there were people here, but then I froze. Propped against the brick wall, next to a small stack of boards, was a sledgehammer. Trying to be quiet, I crept over and picked it up before heading back into the tunnel. When I was little, before Daddy died, he had loved to hunt. I never went with him and didn't remember much of what he hunted, but I do know he had an old hound he'd had since before I was born. The dog had only loved him and being on the trail of something. When Rocker, his name was Rockefeller, got a scent, it was like he was in a trance. He would go and go, this way and that, and to look at him, it looked like he was having a fit, both lost and certain at the same time. But whatever Rocker knew or didn't know, he always found what he was looking for. I felt like Rocker now. I was moving faster and faster as I went down this turn and nav. I felt like I was on the trail of something or traveling on memories I didn't have. Gripping the sledgehammer tightly, I could hear the rising hum of the distant music in my head as I turned the last corner, and then it fell silent. There was another brick wall, and as I approached, it fell away. It was another basement room, but this one was much smaller. It contained a table, a clothes chest, and an old metal bed that had been broken apart. At the far brick wall, a woman was using one of the metal legs from the bed to attack the wall and whatever lay behind it. I felt my head began to swim as I looked at her from behind, and as she turned to look at me, eyes wide with surprise and fear, I felt the sledgehammer slip from my grip as I stumbled back against the now solid wall. I could barely breathe at all, but I managed to get out a single word. "Rachel?" The woman looked at me, her expression less fearful but still guarded. She had the bed leg partially raised in warning. "Yeah. Do I know you?" It was her, but it wasn't, much like the tree on the island. This Rachel looked a few years older, and while she looked stressed and confused at the moment, her eyes didn't seem weighted down by the same quiet sadness I had come to recognize watching the other Rachel for all that time. Still, I didn't know how to answer her question and not sound creepy or crazy. I stared at her for a second, floundering, when she asked another. "You came out of the tree tunnel, right?" I nodded, grateful for something I could answer easily. "Studying me," she said. "Where did you come from?" "Before the tunnel, I mean." I flushed as I tried to think of the right words. I came from Texas. Originally, I mean." She grinned at me for a second before catching herself and trying to look serious again. "Yeah, okay. But do you know how the tree works? How did you find out about the tunnel? How did you get here?" Sighing, I rubbed my head and just started into it. "Look, I know this will sound crazy, but I had a job watching a woman trapped in a room, and that woman was you, or another version of you, and she asked me for help, and I couldn't help her, and then they took me, and I found out she had been dead for a long time but could see me in the future, and then they put something from the tree in me that had been in her that killed her, and then I escaped, and then I figured out where to go to find the tree from things she had painted, and I somehow knew how to go in the tunnels to find different spots, and I'm pretty sure the tunnels lead to different worlds, and I got this sledgehammer, and then I..." "Hold up. God damn. Take a breath. You're going to pass out." She was smiling again, and this time she didn't try to hide it. She looked over what was left of the bed to where the sledgehammer was laying on the floor. And did you say sledgehammer? Whack. So yeah, I believe you. Whack. I've been in those tunnels too. My ex-boyfriend tricked me into moving here so he could tie me to the tree in his place. Whack. Well, not tie me to the tree literally. Take his place as, what? The tree's buddy or something? I don't really know. It's all pretty fucked up and I don't understand all of it. Whack. But what I do understand is that the fucker walled me up in here. At first, I thought I could just pry loose some bricks over time, but nope. He put a layer of concrete on the outside this time. Good ol' Phil. Or Justin. Or whatever. I mainly think of him as fuckface now. Whack. This is taking forever. I stepped up and put my hand on the sledgehammer. Let me do it for a bit. We can take turns. We had cleared away even more brick than she had already managed, but the concrete wall was only starting to show small cracks. I wanted to just keep looking at her, have her talk to me, but I knew she was tired. She nodded reluctantly and let go of the hammer. Before I swung, I looked back at her. How long have you been in here like this? Whack. Rachel scowled. It's hard to say for sure, but I think about 8 months. I let the hammer drop down again as my eyes widened. How did you survive all that time? Her scowl deepened. It's the tree. It won't let me die. I just dip into the tunnel every day for a bit and I never get that hungry or thirsty. A thought occurred to me then. Why didn't you just escape through the tunnels? She quickly shook her head. No, thank you. I've had enough of seeing other worlds. Some of them aren't so nice. And I don't want to be more tied to the tree than I already am. I just want out of here, into my own world, and then I can try and figure out how to get free of my connection to the tree for good. Rachel shrugged. I would have done it eventually with the stupid bed parts, but who knows how long it would have taken. She smiled again. I'm very happy you came to help and brought a sledgehammer with you. Returning her smile, I nodded as I lifted the hammer again. Me too. Whack. We were both wringing with sweat when we crawled through the hole we'd made in the outer wall. Rachel told me that she thought her ex-boyfriend was long gone, but she couldn't be sure, so we had to be careful. Grabbing the sledgehammer from inside the room, we made our way toward the stairs. The house was decorated but quiet, and we saw no sign of anyone as we walked to the front door and opened it. Outside, the sun was coming up on a new day, and as we walked out onto the porch, I jumped a little as Rachel took my hand and gave it a squeeze. I looked over at her. I hadn't been able to help the other Rachel, but maybe that had never been the point at all. Because I thought now she had been able to see more than just other places or the future. She had been able to see into other worlds and possibilities. Like this one, where another version of her was trapped and needed help. A place where I wouldn't be hunted and she could be free. In the end, even when she knew she was dying, Rachel had been determined to help us be together and happy. The morning sun painted beautiful colors on Rachel's face, and looking into her eyes I saw how much she was like the woman I had watched and cared about and tried to save. The woman who, in the end, had saved me instead. I wanted to tell Rachel so many things, ask her so many questions, but all that could come later. Squeezing her hand back, I walked with her away from the house. For now, this was enough.